I wanted to make it unequivocally clear. All Chinese companies, private or public, are subject to the control of the Chinese Communist Party. So for Chinese social media companies, this creates an opportunity and a mechanism for CCP censorship, surveillance, and propaganda that affect not only their users based in China, but around the world, including in Australia.
In the United States, this is a non-partisan issue or bipartisan issue. There's concern across the political spectrum about these security issues, in particular in recent times in relation to TikTok. Is that a fair summary?
It absolutely is. And I would add, I was honored to work with Australian colleagues during my government service. But yes, in Washington, D.C., we've absolutely seen a bipartisan agreement on the threats of TikTok, both from the data security perspective and from the CCP influence concerns.
The authoritarian regimes around the world are watching. They are working hard to undermine us. Their goals are to turn our countries into subservient states, kowtowing to their direct influence, be it the Russian Federation, China, Iran, or other less resourceful yet ambitious regimes.
Well, the reason why we invited you to appear and give evidence for this committee is that you have the unfortunate honour of perhaps being the first known political victim of a foreign interference through social media campaign. And what happened to you, I think, is a very, very salutary lesson for all democracies, which if we don't heed, will be at our peril. So I want to talk a little bit about your experience. I think there's some facts for the record are important. As I understand it, you won your riding in 2019 with a primary vote of 41.7%, but at the subsequent election in 2021 there was an 8-point swing against you, which caused you to lose your seat, and this swing was substantially out of line with the national political results. There was only a 1% swing against the Conservative Party nationally and only a 1% swing in British Columbia. What do you attribute the kind of outside swing result in your riding to?
It's the disinformation that has seeded in my community and activated during the election time. When I say disinformation seeded, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, I tabled the private member bills, and the discussion, the talking heads, the mouthpiece have already started trying to find faults in the proposal. And they have already started characterizing it as an anti-Chinese, an anti-Asian piece of legislation that I was proposing. And the funny thing is that to avoid politicizing the legislation, I deliberately do not mention any country and left that to the Privy Council office to define which country would be subject to the foreign influence registry. And so it started before the election, and during the election you start seeing authoritative articles being written and circulated among the WeChat community, and both attacking my leader then, Mr. Aaron O'Toole, and specifically also using my private member bill to attack me, and claiming that we are anti-Chinese, that we are Chinese haters, and therefore we must be opposed. And should I get reelected again, my bills somehow automagically will be passed, and all Chinese in Canada will be subject to unimaginable Chinese exclusion and Chinese and persecution. And so these are disinformation that were activated soon after the election started, and it came with a ferocity that, frankly speaking, it's not what I had anticipated and expected. So we were caught unprepared.
Today, and we are hearing from a number of diaspora community representatives, because the perspective of diaspora communities is very important to the committee. They are often the first target of attempts of foreign interference because some foreign governments, the Iranian government included, regard people who have Iranian ancestry or descent, no matter where they are in the world, as effectively property of the regime and have obligations towards the regime no matter where they live or what their citizenship is. As you say, there's been some very concerning public reporting about harassment of both Iranian Australians and also their family members back home directly relating to their activism in Australia, which is deeply disturbing given we're a country, a liberal democracy that values free speech and the right to protest, and it is totally unacceptable.
I think this whole area of coping with abuse in the cyberspace is not well developed in Australia. However, we know that this is a widespread abuse going on. So according to the Australian Human Rights Commission, social media postings can be against the law if they discriminate against, harass, bully or racially vilify a person. And I don't really have to say, inciting to violence or threatening to kill people is illegal, and it's not simply a civil offence. But given that, this, I think abuse is widespread in social media in Australia in general, clearly it's a bit of an open slather for the Iranian government's agencies to abuse.
And I'm interested in your observation that it has become very difficult to communicate or connect with family and friends back in Tibet other than through WeChat, and the understandable reluctance of Tibetan Australians to use a platform beholden to the Chinese Communist Party to communicate with their family and friends, given the risk that poses at both ends of the spectrum. It seems clear that there is almost a deliberate strategy to force people onto WeChat for these communications and to prevent these conversations happening on other platforms which are out of the reach of the Chinese Communist Party. Would you agree with that observation, that this is a deliberate strategy?
Yes, I agree that, because even if Tibetans try to Tibetans from Australia or exiled community try to send some information, for example, the speeches and teachings of His Holiness Dalai Lama, and the Tibetans created WeChat groups to listen the teachings and speeches of His Holiness Dalai Lama, and the group, who created the group, or the people in the group are being harassed or arrested by the Chinese government for such just listening or the teachings of His Holiness Dalai Lama. And also if the Chinese government tried to check the phones of the Tibetans, and if there is the picture of the Dalai Lama, they arrest and detain the Tibetans. So it is very dire situation. And WeChat is only, as I told you, that only the way that Tibetans in exile and the Tibetans in Tibet to communicate. So it's very difficult. The WeChat,
Could you give us some insight into particularly those Ukrainian Australians who've been vocal about the war and those who've been outspoken about it, what experiences they've had online and what that's meant for them?
We have many members of our community that have been targeted by either the Russian community or the Russian consulate here in, not here, I'm from Sydney, but in Sydney there are many examples. The things that I would like to draw your attention to, which you're probably aware of, is Semyon Boykov and the following that he has, both through his YouTube channel that has recently been closed, but other social media, including Facebook, Instagram, Telegram. On Telegram, there's also a Telegram channel called Tasmanian Diablo, and that channel actively targets members of our community, starting with the co-chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations that I share my role with, Stefan Romaniev, targeting our ambassador, Ukrainian ambassador to Australia, targeting honorary consul, community leaders that lead rallies, for example, in Sydney and other cities around the country, and making false remarks about them, spinning neo-Nazi narratives, trying to flip the situation, saying that it's Ukraine that's in the wrong, that Ukrainians are warmongers, that what we're doing is basically what Russia is doing to Ukraine, but trying to spin that. And they've found a very innovative and interesting way to do that, where they target different subgroups in Australia to try and influence opinion and perception. For example, through Semyon Boykov and the Russian consulate and Russian agents here in Australia, they have been very successful in infiltrating the anti-vax movement. Yeah. So first they become, they learn about the ideals and aims of a certain movement. They share those ideals and views, quickly become leaders of that, and then through that they place typical Russian narratives and propaganda. They have been very successful in infiltrating that entire anti-vax movement here in Australia. That's just as one example.
Ms. Xu, I just want to direct a question to you. I know you've had similar experiences online that Badasau has just described he's experienced. In your case, they've provided a very unfortunate case study that's been able to be examined, including by your colleagues at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, of the very concerted and coordinated way that you've been singled out and targeted online, including, I think, demonstrating that the targeted online harassment directed at you maps with office hours in Beijing for people who are clearly employed to do this, including that there's a lull during the lunch break time when they take a break from harassing you to go and have some lunch. Can you talk a little bit about your experience, when this started, what you think the motivation of it is, and what the main platforms it's been that it's happened on?
Thank you for the question. I've been, I've been a journalist, initially for the New York Times and the ABC, and later on moved on to a more focused research, long-form research reports for ASPE. And during my, frankly, not very long journalism career from 2016 to now, so 6-7 years, throughout this entire time, the Chinese government has been attempting to silence, intimidate, and harass me. And specifically from 2019, when I was reporting on protests that were happening in Australia in relation to the Hong Kong protests. So there were two sides in Australia. There were Australians or Chinese Australians protesting in solidarity with the Hong Kongers, and people in Australia protesting or rallying in support of Hong Kong police brutality. So because of my reporting on that, the Chinese internet, whether that's orchestrated by someone, whether that's just voluntary sort of anger from the people, I don't know, but there was a large online social harassment campaign. There was an online harassment campaign that occurred on this platform called Weibo, which had such an impact on my family life that I became estranged with my father. And then from there on, I spent 2 or 3 years writing about the human rights crisis in Xinjiang, and specifically there was a report called Uyghurs for Sale with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute that was published in March 2020. Now, Uyghurs for Sale detailed how the Chinese government has subject a large percentage of the Uyghur population to forced labor, working for the supply chains, factories and suppliers of 83 well-known global brands. That includes famous brands like Nike, Adidas, Apple, Google, and these things that we use every day in our daily lives. So because of the influence and impact of that report, the Chinese government decided that I, and perhaps ASPE also, are responsible for disrupting China's supply chains and causing financial damages to the state. So following that, the Chinese government, I would describe this behavior as that they canceled me personally. So in the sense that, tens of media outlets published articles calling me a traitor, a slut, a drug addict. And these are, of course, attempts to character assassinate me. And social media specifically played a big role in this so-called cancellation, because there are hundreds of accounts pumping out content, and that goes across the entirety of the Chinese internet. So from your WeChat, Weibo, to the Chinese version of Quora, which is Zhihu, to these video platforms, the Chinese, again, equivalent of YouTube, because in China people can access YouTube. So you have the Xigua videos, iQIYI videos, Bilibili, and these are all popular platforms that young people watch day in, day out. And these are young people not just in China, but Chinese-speaking individuals and also people who are interested in China from overseas. They can all access all this information. So because the state essentially made me an example of a traitor, so a lot of people, content makers, jumped on this bandwagon and started denouncing me. This led to the result of the sort of the complete breakdown of basically all of my personal relationships I've had in the first 19 years of everybody I've ever known in China. My grandfather banned everyone from speaking to me ever again in my family. My childhood friends, their boyfriends who have now become influencers are denouncing me and describing me, my immoral behaviors on Chinese social media. And this also sort of spilled over to YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, the Western social media platforms. And one kind of funny, but really not funny event was that what we believe to be the Chinese Ministry of State Security, and we have good evidence, I have good evidence for that, repeatedly interrogated a close friend of mine who was a student in Australia and studied in Australia for years, went back to China to visit family. She was known to have a close relationship with me, so the Chinese secret police interrogated her repeatedly to gain information about my personal life. And then around that dossier of information, they built this completely ludicrous account of who I am, and made a documentary about my supposed drug-infested, promiscuous private life, made a 4-part documentary about that, and dropped it on YouTube on Christmas in 2021. Sorry, 2020. This was supposed to, the Chinese government does this a lot, dropping intense things on Christmas, because Western journalists would be taking time off with their family, and nobody would be able to report on this. And that extremely negative content and very defamatory content is there to stay. Once it's on the internet, it's there forever. And personally, like Vadio Tao, I'm still dealing with death threats. I'm still dealing with repeated hacking attempts. Just this week, I received, I'd say, like a dozen hacking attempts across all of my accounts. I'm obviously still doing my journalism work, but I've had to adapt my the way I live, my lifestyle, to one that's akin to a criminal, I would say. People in democracies, politicians, academics, people with good social standing tell me things like I'm going to end up in history books, and that all sounds grand, but what about life? I'll just leave it at that.